While Americans were focused on domestic headlines in July 2025, something happened in Rio de Janeiro that would fundamentally reshape how money moves around the world. The 17th BRICS Summit wasn't just another international gathering with ceremonial handshakes and vague promises about cooperation. Leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with 6 newly admitted members, stood together and presented a document that changes everything: the technical report on the BRICS cross-border payment system. Here's what should grab your attention. This wasn't a proposal for future consideration. This wasn't a feasibility study or a research paper suggesting what might be possible someday. The report detailed an operational framework that's already being implemented right now, processing real transactions, moving actual money between countries without touching the dollar or passing through American banks. Think about how international payments work today. You're a business owner in Brazil wanting to buy manufacturing equipment from India. Your payment doesn't go directly from your bank to the Indian supplier. It routes through SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, the messaging system that basically runs global finance. That transaction converts to dollars, flows through correspondent banks in New York, gets recorded by institutions that report to U.S. regulators, and takes 3 to 5 days to settle. Every step of that journey puts your transaction under the microscope of the American financial system. Now imagine a completely different path. Your payment goes from your Brazilian bank directly to your supplier's Indian bank, settles in real time using your own currencies, and never once touches the dollar or passes through any system Washington can monitor or control. That's not a hypothetical scenario anymore. That's what BRICS Pay actually does, and it's processing transactions right now. The technical system they've built is called BRICS Bridge. Think of it as the financial messaging mechanism designed specifically to operate independently of SWIFT. Here's how it works in practice. Russia operates a system called SPFS, their answer to being threatened with SWIFT disconnection. China runs CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system that already connects with financial institutions in over 120 countries. India has built UPI, a unified payments interface that revolutionized how money moves domestically. Brazil created PIX, processing billions in instant payments since launching in 2020. These systems already exist and function. BRICS Bridge is the connector layer that links them all together through standardized protocols. According to the technical specifications released at the summit, the network uses digital financial assets, essentially central bank digital currencies, pegged to national currencies for settlement. When a Chinese company pays a Russian supplier, the transaction uses digital yuan and digital rubles. No dollar conversion required, no correspondent banking needed, no American institution involved. Let me put the technical capabilities in perspective. SWIFT, the system that's dominated global finance since 1973, processes about 42 million messages per day. That sounds impressive until you do the math. That's roughly 500 messages per second. BRICS Pay can handle 20,000 messages per second with built-in encryption, distributed consensus mechanisms, and multi-factor authentication. The new system is 40 times faster than SWIFT and operates 24/7 with instant settlement compared to SWIFT's 3 to 5 day delays. Have you ever wondered why international wire transfers take so long and cost so much? It's not because the technology is complicated. Your bank can instantly transfer money to your friend across town. The delay exists because SWIFT operates on batch processing developed in the 1970s, requires multiple intermediary banks to verify and process each transaction, and shuts down on weekends and holidays. BRICS Bridge eliminates all those friction points. Transactions settle in seconds, not days. Costs drop from $25 to $50 per transfer to pennies. The system never closes. But here's what makes this development truly significant for Americans. SWIFT isn't just a payment network. It's the enforcement mechanism for dollar dominance. Every SWIFT transaction ultimately settles in dollars. Every message flows through financial institutions that maintain correspondent banking relationships with U.S. banks. Every transfer can be monitored, tracked, and if Washington decides, frozen or blocked entirely. Think about what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. The United States and European allies didn't send troops. They cut Russian banks off from SWIFT. Overnight, Russia couldn't easily pay for imports or receive payment for exports. It was economic warfare achieved through control of the payment rails, and it was devastating. Or it would have been if Russia hadn't been preparing for exactly this scenario. BRICS Pay eliminates all three pillars of dollar control. First, transactions settle in local currencies: yuan, rupees, rubles, reals, rand, whatever the trading partners choose. Second, settlement happens through BRICS central banks, not through New York. Third, the United States has zero visibility into these transactions and zero ability to sanction or block them. Let me paint a scenario that illustrates what this means in practice. You're an American manufacturer who's been buying rare earth minerals from a Chinese supplier for 20 years. You've always paid in dollars through SWIFT. Your Chinese supplier has always accepted dollars because that's how international trade worked. But now your supplier calls and says they're switching to BRICS Pay. Transactions will settle in yuan. If you want to keep buying their minerals, you'll need to acquire yuan, open accounts with banks that connect to BRICS Bridge, and operate outside the dollar system. What do? You need those minerals for your manufacturing process. Your competitors will switch to BRICS Pay if you don't. So you adapt. You start holding yuan. You move some operations to financial institutions that support both systems, and suddenly, you're using fewer dollars in your business operations. Now, multiply that scenario by millions of companies across dozens of countries. According to the Bank for International Settlements, cross-border payments represent roughly $150 trillion annually in transaction value. If even 10% of that volume shifts to BRICS Pay over the next 3 years, we're talking about $15 trillion per year moving outside the dollar system. The network effect that made the dollar indispensable starts working in reverse. Here's what the mainstream financial media isn't telling you. They've been reporting on BRICS discussions about a common currency for years, always dismissing it as impractical or years away from implementation. They were looking at the wrong development. BRICS doesn't need a single currency to challenge the dollar. They need a payment system that bypasses SWIFT and allows countries to trade in their own currencies without needing dollars as an intermediary. That system exists. It's called BRICS Bridge, and it went from concept to operational reality faster than most analysts thought possible. The proof isn't in speeches or press releases. The proof is in pilot programs that have already processed real transactions. Russia and China have been settling bilateral trade through connected systems since 2023. India and the UAE ran test transactions in 2024. Brazil integrated PIX with preliminary BRICS Bridge protocols in early 2025. By the time world leaders gathered in Rio in July 2025 to present the technical report, they weren't proposing something new. They were revealing something that already worked. Think about the implications for our economy. The United States represents about 4% of the global population, but consumes roughly 25% of global resources. We've been able to do that because we export dollars in exchange for real goods. Other countries accept our printed currency because they need dollars to trade with each other through SWIFT. That arrangement has allowed us to run massive trade deficits for decades without the currency collapse that would destroy any other nation. What happens when countries don't need our dollars to trade with each other anymore? What happens when the largest economies on Earth, China, India, Russia, Brazil, build a system where the dollar becomes optional rather than essential? You don't need an economics degree to understand where this leads. When demand for dollars decreases, the value of dollars decreases. When the value of dollars decreases, everything priced in dollars costs more. Your savings lose purchasing power. Your salary buys less. Your retirement accounts denominated in dollars shrink in real terms. The technical report presented in Rio contains something else that deserves attention. The BRICS Cross-Border Payments Initiative includes provisions for expanding the network to partner countries in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. We're not talking about 5 countries building a closed system for themselves. We're talking about a global network being constructed specifically to provide an alternative to SWIFT and the dollar, designed to eventually connect dozens of nations representing the majority of the world's population. According to Russian officials quoted in the technical documentation, transactions between BRICS members using the new system already exceed $200 billion annually. That's not projected volume for 5 years from now. That's actual transaction flow happening right now through the interconnected systems that form the foundation of BRICS Bridge. Pop quiz. What makes a currency valuable? Is it the paper it's printed on, the promises of the government that issues it, the gold stored in vaults backing it? None of those. A currency's value comes from one thing: how many people need to use it. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency because everyone needed dollars to trade globally. SWIFT enforced that need. If you wanted to participate in international commerce, you needed access to dollars and access to SWIFT. BRICS Pay breaks that requirement. And once the requirement breaks, the foundation of dollar dominance breaks with it. The system that allowed America to export inflation, run endless deficits, and consume more than we produce, that system depends entirely on everyone else needing our currency. The moment they don't need it anymore, everything changes. The leaders gathered in Rio weren't declaring war on America. They were simply building an alternative system that serves their interests better than the existing one. Can you blame them? If you're China or India or Brazil, why should your trade with each other require permission from Washington? Why should your central banks hold trillions in dollar reserves that lose value through inflation you can't control? Why should your financial transactions flow through New York banks that can freeze your assets based on political decisions made in another country? BRICS Pay answers those questions with working technology instead of rhetoric. The summit in July 2025 wasn't the beginning of this shift. It was the moment when a parallel financial system reached operational maturity and stepped out of the shadows into full public view. The infrastructure exists, the technology functions, the transactions are processing, and the dollar's dominance just encountered its first real alternative in 80 years. Let me show you exactly how real this system is by walking through the infrastructure that's already built and operating. This isn't vaporware or ambitious planning. These are functioning networks processing billions in transactions right now, and BRICS Bridge is connecting them into a unified alternative to SWIFT. Start with China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS. The People's Bank of China launched this in 2015, and it's been growing quietly while Western media dismissed it as a regional curiosity. According to the latest data from CIPS itself, the system now connects with financial institutions in over 120 countries. That's not 120 Chinese banks. That's 120 countries with participating financial institutions that can send and receive payments through CIPS. Every BRICS member except India is already connected. So are major economies across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you're a company in Kenya wanting to pay a supplier in Thailand, you can route that payment through CIPS, settling in yuan, without ever converting to dollars or touching SWIFT. The infrastructure for dollar-free trade already spans the globe. It's been operating and expanding for a decade, while American policymakers assumed SWIFT was untouchable. Now, look at Russia's system for transfer of financial messages, the SPFS. When Western nations threatened to cut Russia from SWIFT as early as 2014 after Crimea, Moscow didn't just complain about unfair treatment. They built an alternative. The Bank of Russia reports that SPFS now connects 556 organizations across 20 countries. These aren't just Russian banks. We're talking about financial institutions in Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and expanding into other former Soviet states, plus countries seeking sanctions-resistant payment options. Here's what happened that most Americans missed. When the United States and EU actually did cut major Russian banks from SWIFT in February 2022, everyone expected Russia's economy to collapse within weeks. The ruble would become worthless, trade would halt, the country would be financially isolated. Remember those predictions? They were all over the news. Instead, the ruble recovered to pre-sanction levels within months. Russian trade continued flowing, just through different channels. How? Because Russia had spent 8 years building exactly the infrastructure needed to survive SWIFT disconnection. SPFS kept domestic payments running smoothly. CIPS provided the bridge to trade with China, India, and dozens of other countries. The sanctions that were supposed to be economically devastating became a proof-of-concept demonstration that alternatives to SWIFT actually work under real-world pressure. Let's talk about India's Unified Payments Interface, UPI. This system revolutionized how money moves in India, processing over 100 billion transactions in 2024 alone. The Reserve Bank of India built UPI to handle instant payments between bank accounts using mobile phones. It's fast, cheap, and works flawlessly for 1.4 billion people. Now India is internationalizing UPI, signing agreements with countries from Singapore to the UAE to France. Indians traveling abroad can pay local merchants using UPI. Foreign visitors to India can use UPI. And increasingly, businesses are using UPI-linked systems for cross-border trade settlements. Brazil's PIX system launched in November 2020, and it completely transformed Brazilian payments within months. According to the Central Bank of Brazil, PIX processed over 40 billion transactions in 2024, with transaction values exceeding $1.5 trillion. That's more than Brazil's entire GDP flowing through a payment system that didn't exist 5 years ago. Brazilians can send money to anyone instantly, 24/7, at zero cost. The system is so efficient that it's replacing cash, checks, and even credit cards for many transactions. Here's what connects all these pieces. Each system works brilliantly within its own country or region. CIPS excels at yuan-denominated trade. SPFS handles ruble transactions and provides sanctions resistance. UPI dominates India's massive domestic market. PIX transformed Brazilian payments. They're all fast, efficient, and modern. Everything SWIFT isn't. The challenge was linking them together so a payment could flow seamlessly from Brazil to India or from Russia to China using each country's preferred system and currency. That's exactly what BRICS Bridge solves. Think of it as the universal adapter that lets these different systems talk to each other. The technical architecture uses something called a multi-CBDC bridge, which means central bank digital currencies from different countries can be exchanged directly without going through a common intermediary currency. No dollar conversion required, no third-party banks needed, just direct exchange of digital rubles for digital rupees or digital yuan for digital reals at market rates determined by the trading parties. In October 2024, something significant happened that should have been front-page news everywhere. A working prototype of BRICS Pay was demonstrated in Moscow at a gathering of central bank officials and finance ministers from BRICS countries. This wasn't a PowerPoint presentation showing what might be possible someday. According to reports from participants, actual transactions were processed in real time during the demonstration, showing money moving between different national systems with instant settlement. Then, on October 23, 2024, China made a formal announcement backing BRICS Pay. The People's Bank of China issued a statement supporting the initiative and confirming that CIPS would serve as one of the core pillars of the expanded network. That announcement moved this project from the planning phase into active deployment. When the world's second-largest economy and largest trading nation commits its financial infrastructure to a project, that project becomes real very quickly. Let me explain why the timing matters. The Moscow demonstration and China's backing came just 9 months before the Rio Summit. In those 9 months, the system went from prototype to operational framework ready for pilot expansion. That's lightning speed for financial infrastructure that normally takes years or decades to build. The reason it happened so fast is that the components already existed. BRICS Bridge didn't need to build payment systems from scratch. It just needed to create the connector layer, linking existing systems. That's a much simpler technical challenge, and they solved it. Here's the part that should concern anyone holding significant dollar-denominated assets. BRICS Bridge was specifically designed to be sanction-proof. The architects learned from watching the United States weaponize SWIFT against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries. They built a system where sanctions become technically impossible to enforce. How does sanction-proofing work in practice? Traditional SWIFT has a single point of failure. The SWIFT organization itself, headquartered in Belgium, operates under European law and complies with U.S. sanctions. Washington can pressure Brussels, Brussels can pressure SWIFT, and SWIFT can disconnect any bank or country from the network. That's how financial sanctions work, by cutting access to the payment rails. BRICS Bridge uses distributed nodes with no single headquarters that can be pressured or sanctioned. The messaging system operates on blockchain-based protocols that are encrypted and uncensorable by design. Even if one node goes offline, the network keeps functioning through other nodes. It's similar to how the internet routes around damage. Settlement happens through central bank digital currencies, which means no correspondent banking relationships are required. There's no U.S. bank in the middle that can be ordered to freeze funds or block transactions. Think about what this means strategically. The United States has used financial sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy for decades. Sanction regimes against Iran, North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, and many others rely entirely on dollar dominance and SWIFT access. If you can't use SWIFT, you can't trade globally. If you can't trade globally, your economy suffers. That's the theory, and it worked for a long time because there was no alternative. Now there is an alternative. A country can be cut off from SWIFT and continue trading with 45% of the global economy through BRICS Pay. Those sanctions lose most of their bite. The leverage Washington has accumulated over 80 years of dollar dominance starts evaporating. Other countries notice this and become less afraid of U.S. sanctions, less willing to align their policies with American interests out of fear of economic isolation. Let's talk about the scale of the coalition that's building around this system. The original BRICS 5, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, represented enormous economic power on their own. China is the world's largest manufacturing nation and second largest economy. India has the world's largest population and fastest growing major economy. Russia is a commodities superpower, controlling huge supplies of oil, gas, wheat, and fertilizers. Brazil dominates South American trade. Together, these 5 countries already represented roughly 30% of global GDP and 40% of the world's population. Then, in 2024, BRICS expanded dramatically. 6 new full members joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Argentina. That expansion wasn't random. These countries bring specific strategic assets to the coalition. Saudi Arabia and the UAE control enormous oil production and the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. Iran brings energy resources and a desperate need for sanctions-resistant payment systems. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, one of the world's most critical trade choke points. Ethiopia represents East African growth potential. Argentina provides access to South American agricultural exports and mineral resources. According to analysis from the World Bank and IMF, the expanded BRICS coalition now represents approximately 36% of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity, and 45% of the world's population. But here's the more important number. BRICS countries control over 40% of global oil production, 50% of wheat exports, 70% of rare earth mineral production, and significant percentages of virtually every critical commodity. What does that mean in practical terms? It means the countries building BRICS Pay aren't peripheral economies trying to create a niche system. They're the countries that produce the physical goods the world needs. If you want oil, wheat, steel, rare earth minerals, manufactured electronics, pharmaceuticals, or thousands of other essential products, you're likely buying from a BRICS country. And increasingly, those countries want to be paid in their own currencies through their own payment system. The World Gold Council reports that BRICS central banks have been accumulating gold reserves at accelerating rates over the past 5 years. China holds over 2,200 tons of gold in official reserves, though many analysts believe the real number is significantly higher. Russia has over 2,300 tons. India holds over 800 tons. These countries aren't buying gold because they love shiny metal. They're buying gold as a reserve asset that holds value regardless of which currency dominates global trade. They're preparing for a world where the dollar isn't the automatic store of value. Here's the calculation that should alarm American policymakers. According to trade data compiled by the International Monetary Fund, intra-BRICS trade, meaning trade between BRICS member countries, exceeded $500 billion in 2024. That's a conservative estimate that only counts official bilateral trade flows. If you include trade with partner countries and nations moving toward BRICS alignment, the number easily exceeds $1 trillion annually. Now, imagine even half of that trade shifts from SWIFT to BRICS Pay over the next 3 years. That's $250 billion to $500 billion per year, moving out of the dollar system. These transactions would no longer require dollar conversion. They wouldn't flow through U.S. correspondent banks. American financial institutions would lose the fees from processing those transactions. The Treasury Department would lose visibility into those trade flows. And most importantly, the demand for dollars would decrease by hundreds of billions annually. But it doesn't stop at current BRICS trade. According to the technical documentation from the Rio Summit, BRICS is actively negotiating with 34 additional countries about various levels of partnership or membership. These discussions include major economies like Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, Nigeria, and Vietnam. If even a quarter of these countries integrate with BRICS Pay for their trade with BRICS members, you're talking about trillions in transaction volume shifting away from dollar settlement. The network effect that made the dollar indispensable starts working in reverse. Right now, most countries hold dollar reserves because they need dollars for international trade. They need dollars because most trade settles in dollars. Trade settles in dollars because SWIFT requires dollar conversion for most transactions. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that's maintained dollar dominance for decades. BRICS Pay breaks that cycle. When China can buy oil from Saudi Arabia in yuan, when India can buy fertilizer from Russia in rupees, when Brazil can buy machinery from China in reals, when all these transactions settle instantly without touching dollars, the need for dollar reserves diminishes. As the need diminishes, central banks start diversifying. As they diversify, demand for dollars decreases. As demand decreases, value decreases. The self-reinforcing cycle runs backward. Let me give you a concrete example of how fast this can happen. In 2000, the euro represented about 20% of global foreign exchange reserves. The dollar represented about 71%. Over the next decade, as countries diversified, the euro climbed to nearly 28%, while the dollar fell to 62%. That shift happened gradually, driven mainly by the formation of the European Union and countries wanting to balance their reserve holdings. There was no major crisis, no dramatic event. Just slow diversification over 10 years, and the dollar's share of global reserves dropped by almost 10 percentage points. Now, imagine the same kind of shift, but accelerated and driven by actual infrastructure that makes dollar usage optional rather than necessary. We're not talking about countries deciding to hold euros instead of dollars as a financial hedge. We're talking about countries building an alternative payment system that eliminates the need to hold dollars at all for much of their international trade. That's a fundamentally different dynamic with the potential to cause much faster and more dramatic changes. The data from pilot programs already shows the direction this is heading. According to Russia's Ministry of Finance, over 40% of Russian trade is now settled in rubles and yuan, up from less than 10% before the SWIFT sanctions. India and Russia have increased their bilateral trade by over 300% since 2021, with most transactions settling in rupees and rubles. China and Brazil completed their first direct currency swap transaction in 2023, eliminating dollar intermediation for that trade. These aren't test transactions for demonstration purposes. These are real companies doing real business and choosing to settle outside the dollar system because it's faster, cheaper, and more reliable than SWIFT. The infrastructure isn't coming someday. The infrastructure exists right now, connecting over 100 countries, processing hundreds of billions in transactions annually, and expanding every month. BRICS Pay is the unifying layer that makes this infrastructure seamless and accessible to any country that wants an alternative to dollar dependence. And based on the momentum from the past 2 years, a lot of countries want exactly that. Now, let's talk about timelines, because this isn't some distant theoretical threat. We can actually map when BRICS Pay reaches critical mass and what that means for the dollar's reserve currency status. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated in late 2024 that a pilot version of BRICS Pay could appear before the end of 2026, with operational status targeted for the 2028 to 2030 timeframe. But here's what you need to understand. That's diplomatic language for a phased rollout that's already underway. The deployment follows three distinct phases, and we're currently in phase 1. From 2025 through 2026, BRICS countries are expanding bilateral settlement agreements. Russia settles with China in rubles and yuan. India settles with UAE in rupees and dirhams. Brazil settles with China in reals and yuan. These aren't test transactions anymore. These are established trade relationships moving off the dollar permanently. The bilateral phase creates the demand for phase 2. Phase 2 runs from 2026 through 2027, and this is when BRICS Bridge becomes the unified digital payment network connecting all those bilateral arrangements. Instead of needing separate agreements between every possible pair of countries, the network creates a common standard. Any country connected to BRICS Bridge can instantly transact with any other connected country in their chosen currencies. According to technical specifications from the Bank of Russia, this network goes live for expanded pilot operations in late 2026, with full commercial deployment targeted for 2027. Think about what that means practically. By the end of 2027, a company in South Africa could pay a supplier in Indonesia using Rand and Rupiah settled instantly through BRICS Bridge with $0 involvement. That transaction is impossible today without converting through dollars and routing through SWIFT. In 2 years, it becomes routine. The friction that currently forces companies to use dollars, that friction disappears completely. Phase 3 extends from 2028 through 2030 and involves full interoperability with partner countries across Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. This is when the network effect reaches critical mass. BRICS countries represent 36% of global GDP. But when you include all the partner countries and nations moving toward integration, you're approaching 50% of global economic activity. At that scale, BRICS Pay doesn't need to replace SWIFT globally. It just needs to become the dominant system in the global south, and the dollar's reserve status collapses anyway. Here's the math that should terrify anyone relying on dollar stability. The dollar is currently held as roughly 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, down from 71% in 2000. That decline happened during a period when there was no real alternative to the dollar for international trade. Countries diversified simply as a risk management strategy, but they still needed dollars for most transactions. Now, imagine that same diversification pressure with an actual functioning alternative system. If BRICS Pay processes 40% of global South trade by 2027, a conservative estimate based on current adoption rates, that removes roughly $4 trillion to $5 trillion in annual transaction volume from the dollar system. Those transactions don't require dollar conversion anymore. The companies doing that trade don't need to hold as many dollar reserves. The banks facilitating those transactions don't need correspondent banking relationships with New York. The feedback loop that supported the dollar for 80 years starts unwinding. Let me explain how network effects work, because this is crucial to understanding the timeline. A network becomes valuable when everyone else uses it. Telephones weren't useful when only 10 people had them. They became indispensable when millions had them. The same principle applies to currencies and payment systems. The dollar is valuable because everyone needs it to trade globally. SWIFT is essential because everyone uses it. That's network effect creating lock-in, but network effects cut both ways. Once enough participants switch to an alternative, the old network starts losing value rapidly. Think about what happened to MySpace when Facebook reached critical mass, or Blockbuster when Netflix became the norm. The transition doesn't happen gradually over decades. It happens suddenly once the tipping point passes. Users flee the old network for the new one because everyone else is fleeing. The value collapse accelerates itself. The dollar's tipping point arrives when enough global trade can bypass dollar settlement that countries no longer need to hold massive dollar reserves. Based on IMF data on reserve currency composition and trade flows, that tipping point likely occurs when 30% to 40% of global trade settles in non-dollar currencies through systems like BRICS Pay. We're currently at about 15% non-dollar settlement. The growth rate over the past 3 years suggests we hit 30% by 2027 or 2028. That's the point where the network effect reverses and the dollar enters terminal decline as a reserve currency. What does terminal decline look like? It's not hyperinflation or overnight collapse. It's watching your dollars buy 20% less this year than last year, then another 20% less the year after. It's watching your retirement account numbers stay the same, while everything you need to buy costs twice as much. It's watching the purchasing power of a lifetime of savings evaporate over 5 to 7 years, while economists on television explain that. This is a complicated geopolitical transition, and there's nothing anyone could have done. Now let's connect this to energy, because this is where the dollar's reserve status truly lives or dies. The petrodollar system, the arrangement where oil is priced and traded in dollars, has been the foundation of dollar dominance since the 1970s. Every country needs energy. If energy is priced in dollars, every country needs dollars. That created automatic permanent demand for U.S. currency regardless of trade balances or economic policies. In June 2024, something happened that should have been treated as a 5-alarm fire for dollar stability. Saudi Arabia let the 50-year petrodollar agreement expire without renewal. That agreement, struck in 1974 after the Nixon shock ended dollar-gold convertibility, committed Saudi Arabia to pricing oil in dollars exclusively. In exchange, the United States provided military protection and security guarantees. For 5 decades, that agreement ensured that global oil markets operated in dollars. The expiration wasn't a dramatic announcement or a hostile move. Saudi Arabia simply allowed the agreement to lapse and began accepting multiple currencies for oil sales. According to reports from Reuters and Bloomberg, Saudi Arabia now accepts yuan for oil sales to China, their largest customer. The UAE accepts yuan. Russia sells oil and gas in rubles and yuan to Asian customers. Iran would love to sell in any currency except dollars, given U.S. sanctions. Iraq is negotiating yuan-denominated oil sales with China. Here's what the numbers show. According to the Energy Information Administration, China imported roughly 11 million barrels of oil per day in 2024. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, UAE, and other BRICS-aligned nations supplied over 60% of those imports. If even half of those transactions now settle in yuan through CEPs instead of dollars through SWIFT, that's approximately $800 billion annually in oil trade that no longer requires dollar conversion. That's just China's imports. Add India, Brazil, and other BRICS countries buying oil in local currencies, and you're approaching $2 trillion per year in energy trade moving off the dollar. But it gets worse for dollar dominance. Once BRICS Pay reaches full operational status in 2027, the remaining friction preventing non-dollar oil sales disappears. Saudi Arabia might prefer dollars from tradition, but if their Asian customers want to pay in yuan and BRICS Bridge makes that settlement instant and costless, why refuse? When 80% of global oil consumption happens in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, regions where BRICS Pay will dominate, the petrodollar becomes optional, and optional means dying. Let me paint the scenario for 2028 based on current trajectories. China buys oil from Saudi Arabia in yuan, settled through BRICS Pay in seconds. India buys gas from Russia in rupees, settled instantly. Brazil buys refined products from UAE in reals, no dollar conversion needed. These 3 countries alone represent over 20 million barrels per day of oil consumption. At $80 per barrel, that's $1.6 billion per day, or roughly $600 billion annually. None of it requiring dollars, none of it flowing through SWIFT, none of it creating demand for dollar reserves. The petrodollar was never just about oil pricing. It was the mechanism that created permanent structural demand for dollars, regardless of U.S. economic fundamentals. Without it, the dollar becomes just another currency competing on actual merit against the euro, yuan, and others. And based on U.S. debt levels, deficit spending, and monetary policy, the dollar doesn't win that competition. So, what do you do as an American watching this transition unfold? How do you protect your wealth, your savings, your retirement, when the currency everything is denominated in is entering structural decline? Let me give you the practical action plan. First, diversify out of dollar-only assets immediately. That doesn't mean selling everything and fleeing to foreign currencies. It means holding international stocks, commodities, Bitcoin, and assets that maintain value regardless of which currency dominates global trade. If you're 100% invested in U.S. stocks and bonds denominated in dollars, you have catastrophic concentration risk. When the dollar declines, even if those stock prices rise in nominal terms, your purchasing power still shrinks. Second, consider physical gold as a core holding. When the dollar lost reserve currency status before, in 1971, when Nixon ended gold convertibility, gold repriced from $35 per ounce to over $800 within a decade. That's a 20 times increase, reflecting gold's role as the ultimate reserve asset when fiat currencies fail. Today, gold trades around $2,000 per ounce. If the dollar loses reserve status over the next 5 years, seeing gold at $5,000 to $10,000 isn't speculation. It's historical pattern recognition. Third, understand that this transition is mathematical inevitability, not political conspiracy. The United States represents 4% of the global population, but consumes 25% of global resources. We've been able to do that by exporting printed dollars in exchange for real goods. That arrangement only works when everyone needs our dollars. BRICS Pay means they don't need our dollars anymore. The imbalance corrects. Our purchasing power declines to match our actual productive output. That's not anti-American sentiment, that's economics. Fourth, own assets that produce real value or generate income in multiple currencies. Rental properties, dividend-paying international stocks, businesses that operate globally. These assets maintain value because they produce something useful regardless of currency fluctuations. Your savings account denominated in dollars produces nothing and will lose purchasing power steadily as the dollar declines. The goal isn't to get rich from this transition, the goal is to not get destroyed by it. Fifth, educate yourself about what's actually happening instead of relying on mainstream financial media that has incentives to downplay this threat. The people who will suffer most from dollar decline are the people who don't see it coming until it's too late to adapt. Every month you delay diversifying is another month closer to the tipping point where your options become limited and expensive. Here's the final warning, and I need you to understand how serious this is. The dollar's dominance has lasted 80 years, from the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement that established the dollar as the world's reserve currency up to 2024. That's longer than most currency regimes survive. The British pound sterling was the global reserve currency for about 100 years before the dollar replaced it. These transitions happen. They're historically normal. And we're living through the early stages of the next transition right now. BRICS Pay is the mechanism cutting the last threads of dollar dominance. The system is operational, the infrastructure is built, the adoption is accelerating. By 2027 to 2030, based on the deployment timeline and current growth rates, the dollar will be a global currency, not the global currency. Your purchasing power, your savings, your retirement accounts, all denominated in a currency entering structural decline. The window to protect yourself closes in 2026 before the transition accelerates into Phase 2. After that, everyone will be scrambling to diversify. Asset prices will reflect the coming dollar decline, and your options become limited and expensive. The advantage goes to the people who see what's coming and act before the crowd realizes what's happening. This isn't about fear or panic. This is about awareness and adaptation. The global financial system is changing in ways that will reshape how we trade, what we use for money, and where economic power resides. Americans who understand this transition and position themselves accordingly will preserve their wealth. Those who ignore it or assume the dollar's dominance is permanent will watch their purchasing power evaporate. The choice is yours, the timeline is clear, and the infrastructure replacing the dollar system is already processing transactions right now while most people aren't paying attention. BRICS Pay didn't just replace SWIFT in theory. It's replacing SWIFT in practice, one transaction at a time, building toward the moment when the dollar's 80-year reign as the world's reserve currency becomes a chapter in history books rather than our economic reality.